Welcome and thank you for joining this very important report launch entitled Ending Waste Colonialism, Governing Plastic Pollution. This is a follow through of our previous report entitled Malaysia is not a garbage dump: Citizens Against Corruption, Complacency, Crime and Climate Justice. In that report, we identify key issues that led to environmental degradation and the role that corruption plays in facilitating these activities. The devastating impact of plastic waste on communities and families is heartbreaking, and more effort has to be done in Malaysia to better manage this menace. The Centre to Combat Corruption and Cronyism, or better known as C4 Centre, is a non-governmental organization that looks at corruption and good governance issues. We call for open and transparent policies from the government and advocate for public participation in the business of government. We also look at calling out corrupt officials and politicians. We have extended our scope of corruption to look at other intersections of corruption such as environment, which includes carbon trading and storage, human rights and corruption in the smuggling and trafficking of people. The scope of corruption is extensive and comes in many forms. In terms of plastic waste, we as society need to accept that recycling is a myth, where less than 9% of plastic ever produced is recycled. This is due to a number of reasons, from being unrecyclable, mixing with harmful composite items, and overproduction. Plastic is taking a serious toll on our life, biodiversity, oceans, and marginalized communities. It is this concern that prompted us to look at Japan plastic waste coming into Malaysia, as they were the biggest receiver of Japanese plastic waste among other countries. We researched this in line with the latest International Negotiating Committee session, INC3, in November 2023. There was a drive to advocate for the end of plastic pollution, and unfortunately, one of the key measures to end pollution includes recycling. We wanted to bring this discussion that recycling is not a viable solution to the public, to better understand the issues involved, and for policymakers to tinker with solutions that are tangible and real. In this webinar, we will be discussing key findings in terms of the export of plastic waste from Japan and the reasons, the issues with the capacity of local Malaysian waste recyclers to manage the influx of plastic, including their capacity to do it in an environmentally sound manner, as required under the Basel Convention. We will also discuss the high volume of plastic waste and the need for thorough governance structure. We will also be calling for Japan to be a leader in leading the world out of plastic export practice and help develop national level structures to manage plastic waste, hence stopping waste colonialism. The session today will include a presentation of the report findings by the author of the report, Ms. Wong, followed by a panel discussion comprising experts from the US, UK, and Japan. I take this opportunity to thank Jim Puckett from Basel Action Network US, Ms. Lauren Weir from Environmental Investigation Agency UK, Dr. Shiori Shakuto from University of Sydney, Mr. Hirotaka Koike from Greenpeace Japan for being our panelists, and of course our team for putting together this report. I look forward to a fruitful discussion. Hope that this can be a trigger for bigger and more serious conversations of the menace of plastic. Once again, thank you for joining us today and have a great day ahead.
We can't hear you.
Your audio is not working again.
We can hear you now.
Oh dear, I can't hear you. Okay. Original audio. Okay, so if we unmute original, we can hear her. Okay. Wait, nah.
Hear the interpreter as well. So I'm just wondering whether we should not do simultaneous interpretation, but just take turns. So I don't know, Siping or Nabila, please advise what should we do? Should I just continue with my presentation? Huh. I'm not getting any.
Yes, you can.
Okay, so
Okay.
you can hear me, right?
Yes, we can.
I'm gonna put on my headphones again. All right, all good?
Yes.
Okay, and I can't hear the interpreter anymore, so something must have worked.
No,
Oh,
I-
you hear?
これからですね、目的と
Okay.
やり方、そして、
Um,
I can hear
Okay.
you very clear.
yeah, and I can hear you too, which is
Clear.
happen, right? So why don't we just do we just take turns to until back-end managers to solve this problem.
I see. I can. But I think, see how is the time? Is it?
Yeah, try to be quick. Yeah,
Uh,
we need to watch the time as well. Oh yeah. We need to assign the interpreter to.
The Japanese channel. Can you try to work on that, Ben?
Okay, meanwhile, I'm just going to jump into my presentation, okay? Can I have the front page of the first page of the presentation, please? And full screen, please. Go back. Well, okay, and yes, okay, thank you. Hi everyone, thank you for joining us today. I'm especially grateful to our
皆
speakers,
さん、こんにちは。
team speakers for joining us. So this is an overview of my report, our
これからで
report.
すね、そのレポートを発表します。
We've been conducting this research
去年の8月からずっとリサーチしています。
and basically we found nothing. And that's the gist of the presentation. I think for the interpretation is a bit tricky. So let's just take turns, Mr. Interpreter. Encik, I can. Encik.
Yeah, okay, you can continue.
Okay, thank you. Yes. So basically, we started out wondering why Japan is sending so much plastic waste to Malaysia. We were following the data released by Basel Action Network. They extract data from the UN Comtrade database, and we noticed that the exports from Japan is very high, and Japan is the top exporting country for plastic waste to Malaysia. And Japan is a very small country. The population is quite high, but it's still a relatively small country.
まあ、
So
調べた
why-
結果ではですね、やっぱり日本からが一番たくさんその廃棄物をマレーシアに輸出してるんです。なぜでしょう？ Okay, continue.
Why is Japan sending so many plastic waste here? Once the plastic waste reaches Malaysia, it comes in hundreds of containers, millions of kilograms of plastic waste. What happens to them? They get sent to the factories. And then how much benefits our domestic plastic manufacturers? How much
1
gets
回
re-
100コンテナ以上の輸出が入っています。もう何ミリオンキログラムになっています。で、それがマレーシアの工場に入って、に廃棄、そのリサイクルできるか、今から話します。
we asked the government for a list of recyclers who have import permits. They didn't want to give it to us. Thankfully, someone from our parliament asked for it, and they got a list.
そして国からですね、いくつかのリサイクルの会社が許可を持ってますかと聞いたんですけれども、なかなか出してくれないんです。でも誰かのね、一人の 政治家からそのデータを出してくれました。
And so we got the list, we got the addresses, we found contact numbers, we called every single one of the AP holders in the state of Selangor, which is where Selangor is the most industrialized, is the wanted to speak to us.
で、そのいろんなデータ、情報とかですね、連絡先は、特にセランゴール州、マレーシアで一番工業団地がいっぱいあるところ、で、そのすべての会社に連絡したんですけれども、
Yeah, so we wanted to visit the facilities and check and see. We wanted to learn whether there's environmentally sound management of plastic waste. Maybe the recycling of plastic waste could be done in a proper manner where pollutants are controlled and there's less harm on the environment. But that door was shut. Like we couldn't open that door. We couldn't go there. So just quickly, just the previous slide. The previous slide highlights how Japan exports, the graph, how Japan exports to Asia. And as we can see, many of these countries, Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, has very high levels of plastic waste mismanagement. And they are non-OECD countries. And under the Basel Convention, the export from OECD country to non-OECD countries should be taken with care. There are certain provisions whereby countries can adopt to ban all exports of waste to non-OECD countries, and this has been adopted by the European Union, but not Japan. Interpreter?
I think he actually now has his own channel.
Oh, okay, cool, perfect.
Yeah.
Okay, next slide. Okay, and in EU, US, UK, they are in the bar charts. And we can see that Japan's exports amount to half of the total amount of exports from the other countries, including the EU, which is made up of 20 over countries. Next. And in this whole question about the export and import of plastic waste, there's definitely an economic angle, there's an environmental angle, there's the angle of human rights. Where does governance fit in? I would say governance is the overarching umbrella covering everything. If there's no governance, there's no way we can control corruption. It's very difficult to ensure the protection of human rights, and it's very difficult to enforce whatever regulations there are in the Basel Convention. If any of the public sector actors are compromised, they are not going to enforce whatever regulations or guidelines that is set by the international community or adopted by the national government. So this is a quick table. And everything in my presentation is in the report. So if I'm going too fast, please feel free to read the report. We will share it with you all later. If there's no strong institutions to ensure the anti-corruption measures and that there's transparency and there's public access to data, then there is a risk of corruption and basically non-compliance of any rules and regulations, which will lead to human rights abuses and environmental pollution. So that's the overarching framework of the whole report. And then diving into the more substantive sections of the report, we discuss how Japan and Malaysia govern the trade of plastic waste since the Basel Plastic Waste Amendment. So the Basel Convention, sorry, I am assuming that everyone knows all these technical terms, but let me try to quickly explain them. So the Basel Convention is an international environmental agreement that regulates the movement, transboundary movement of hazardous waste. And before this, plastics was not considered hazardous until China banned the import of plastics and other waste in 2018. And then plastic just went everywhere when China stopped absorbing it. And so because of that, the world recognized that plastic waste is a problem, and then they decided to regulate plastic waste under the Basel Convention as well. And that's called the Basel Convention Plastic Waste Amendments. They amended the convention in 2019, and it came into effect in 2021. So both Japan and Malaysia have extensive guidelines and criteria for companies that want to export and import waste. Especially for certain waste, mixed waste, so there are three categories of waste. One is a clean, homogeneous category where it can be freely traded. No one's gonna regulate it or monitor it. Another one is Y48, mixed plastic waste. So this plastic waste requires the consent of the importing country to receive the waste. And in Japan, there's all these guidelines. You have to apply to the Ministry of Environment, you have to apply, and the Ministry of Environment needs to go through all the documents. The exporter needs to report how the plastic waste is going to be treated in their destination country, what processes are going to be used, what pollution controls there are, whether the environmental laws are of the same standard as laws in Japan. And only after the exporter has met all these requirements will the Ministry of Environment approve it, and then they will inform the Ministry of Trade, and then the shipment can be exported, can move. And then in Malaysia, Malaysia's regulation for plastic waste is actually one step better than the plastic waste amendments, because Malaysia supposedly regulates all trade of plastic waste under the code HS 3915. So even if it's mixed, clean and homogeneous, usually under the Basel Convention, there's no need to regulate it. But for Malaysia, if you want to bring in any type of plastic waste, including the clean one, which is B3011, you still need an import permit. And in order to get the import permit, on paper, it looks very good. You have to meet 19 criteria. You have to make sure that your factory is clean, you manage the waste properly, you have to declare where your residual waste goes to. You need to make sure that the company that's exporting to you is ISO certified, and you need to send photographs of the exact shipment before you can apply for the import permit. So everything on paper looks very nice. But what's happening in reality? That was what we set out to explore. And unfortunately, due to a lack of data and due to people not wanting to talk to us, we cannot conclusively make any statements, but we can, our entire report provides a lot of hints for you to come to your own conclusion. So based on UN Comtrade data, we can see here that exports of plastic waste from Japan to Malaysia is increasing. And worryingly, PVC is also increasing. And PVC is, it should fall under Y48. It requires prior informed consent from Malaysia. And PVC comes with a lot of problems from the manufacturing process all the way until waste treatment process. It releases a lot of toxic chemicals. So this is worrying. We don't know where the PVC is going. We don't know how it's being treated. Next. And then after going through all the less interesting parts about regulating the trade, our report then go into how waste in general, how waste is managed in Japan and Malaysia. So we just provide a broad overview, but we provide additional resources in our footnotes, and there's a lot of information about waste management in Japan. Many reports have been written. They have many experts there. And we can see that for this chart refers to household municipal waste. Only 4.8% is recycled. It's anyone who has any idea of Japan knows that in Japan you have to segregate waste very carefully. But only 4%, 4.8% is meant for recycling. The rest is sent to incinerators, and then some are sent for processing. Next. Oh, sorry, I don't have a chart here in these slides, but in the report, there's another chart where we focus in on plastic waste. Not we, but whoever who prepared the report is the Plastic Waste Management Institute. And we can see when they talk about direct incineration, for municipal waste and for industrial waste, direct incineration doesn't all mean just going to WTEs, but it also includes chemical recycling, thermal recovery, incineration for heat, for energy, for pyrolysis. Everything falls under intermediate processing or direct incineration. So we have another chart in the report. So more incentive for you to read the report. Okay, next. For Malaysia, our waste management ecosystem is very fragmented. Our governments have been telling us for the past 30, 40 years to recycle, and we still don't have a proper recycling system, especially at the household level. These are examples of waste that are washed in by flood waters, by the ocean currents. On the left, it's a photo taken by Dr. Shiori. You'll hear from her later. It's in a place called Tanjung Harapan, the Cape of Hope. And the Cape of Hope is located on Pulau Indah, the beautiful island. And this is how it looks like. Because when we try to go through official channels and try to collect official data and numbers, it's very hard to get them. So we decided to go to the ground and just to capture what's happening in reality. And this is what's happening in reality. There's a lot of open dumping and open burning. If you look at a photo, this little part of waste being burnt on the left, and at the bottom. On the left, there's a road. Beside the road, immediately there are residential areas. There's housing, and then to the right, there's a lot of plastic waste, e-waste, bales, jumbo bags, all there. So it's industrial area, piling up probably illegally, potentially smuggled waste, illegal burning, open burning, and then immediately housing area. And all these are clearly industrial waste. We have we suspect that most of it is imported, but we don't have evidence because it's all shredded waste. Next. Oh, and there's a long story if you would like to ask me, maybe you can take the conversation another time, but people have tried to do something about the illegal dumps, especially the biggest one in Klang right now. Everyone has been to visit the dump. Politicians, law enforcement, government from federal, state, local, and the dump is still there, and the burning is still there, and the people living around the dump are still affected. Aside from the dumps, while going through the dumps, we did find small pieces of waste, trash that might be related to Japan. It's difficult to trace officially what type of Japanese waste is coming in and where it's going, but at the dump sites, we can see bits and pieces. And of course, besides from Japan, there's also Mr. Rogers from the US. But that's the thing. In 2018, 2019, we found a lot of waste like this, which is identifiable. We could see where the waste originated from. But now, okay, these are more examples of waste that is, it looks like industrial waste because it's one whole bale full of the same type of container. Next. Okay, sorry, next. Yes, so I wanted to come to this. So before this, in 2018, 2019, when this whole plastic waste amendment came about, it was very sexy for journalists from other countries to come to Malaysia and ask, did you see any waste from my country? Can you bring us to see the waste? And then they'll take photos and then they'll bring it back to their country and write a report about it. But unfortunately now, fortunately or unfortunately, due to increasing enforcement efforts and awareness generally, there is less dumping of the type of municipal waste where we can trace it back to the countries, but there's still dumping going on, and it's these type of waste, shredded material. It could be hard, it could be soft, it could smell like solvents, it could have no smell, it could be in flakes, it could be in little strips like that. But this is the situation now. It's still dumping happening. Can we go to the slide before? There's still a lot of unmarked facilities. They don't have signboards. We don't know what's going on. And if you look at the photo on the top left, Sungai Petani, that's what happens when the operators decide that this is not a lucrative business and we leave. And then they leave all their stockpiles there. And this, according to the guard that was there, this factory has been vacant for a few years. And that's what is happening to plastic waste in Malaysia. Next. Let's go to the final slide. And finally, in short, there's a complete lack of transparency. And when it comes to good governance, transparency and accountability is very important. When illegal trade, so yesterday, 2 days ago, the UNODC released a report highlighting how illegal trafficking of waste is still a big problem. Today in Indonesia, right now, there's a protest about how they found Japanese waste among plastic scraps that were exported to Indonesia together with paper waste cargo, waste paper cargo. So the plastics were inserted with the paper. So with all this illegality and smuggling going on, the public is the watchdog. The public, especially the people living around the factories, the waste need to land somewhere. And the people living in around the factories are very, very important sources of information. But if we can't get information, if they don't know anything, what's allowed and what's not allowed and what's happening, how are they going to report it to the authorities? So in sum, we need more information about what is being traded for plastic waste. We know in Malaysia that there's a lot of mismanagement, there's a lot of illegality going on. We argue that the plastic waste exports and imports need to be phased out, and all countries need to focus on managing, collecting, sorting domestically generated plastics. And this is very important in the context of the Global Plastics Treaty. We need to look upstream. There's no point looking downstream anymore. We try it, and we don't have time to keep trying. And I will end with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for sharing the comprehensive findings, Weir. We hope that we will have a fruitful discussion with the panelists afterwards from these findings. Now, we will continue the session with the panel presentation. Our first panel is Mr. Jim Puckett. He is the Executive Director from Basel Action Network, or known as BAN. Jim will present on the myth of plastic waste export for recycling and illegal trade. Please go ahead, Jim.
Sure, I'll try to share my screen. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, let me see if I can share. Yeah. You see okay?
Yes.
All right, so thank you everyone, and thank you Hui Yi and Sri Peng especially. I'm just going to cover a few points, and hopefully we'll learn something, and it'll be good fodder for discussion later. But this is about the plastic waste to Malaysia. What are the drivers and restraints? I think it's very important to first off just think about why waste moves at all. So in today's program, I'm going to cover that, why waste is moving, Why doesn't it stay where it was generated? What the Basel Convention is all about, Japan and the history of the Basel Convention, and what we're learning with this report, and then some conclusions of my own from what I've gathered over the years in this report. So look at why waste moves. I think it's really important to think about an economic concept, policy, that's called cost externalization. Really, what we're talking about here is waste colonization, as it's termed. But what that also means, it's also known as cost externalization. What is that? Let me see if I can advance my slide here. Not advancing. Let's try this one. There we go. So the history of pollution is all about cost externalization, really, since the beginning of time, whether it's air pollution, water pollution, or waste trade. It's all stemming from the fact of somebody not paying the bills, somebody trying to find someone who's going to take your waste without any liabilities or costs. And that's called cost externalization. It's the market distortion, because things should balance. You should pay your dues. You should not have a bill out there that nobody's going to pay. So it's really a market distortion that occurs when an action taken damages others or it damages nature, resulting in a cost that is not paid by that actor, either to prevent it in the first place or to compensate for the damage done. Throughout history, those that extract resources, use resources, and harness technology seldom have had to pay or charge the entirety of the true costs that would account for or prevent the damage done by their actions. So if you look at interesting to look at the history of waste management as it was developing in the North, in the West. We had a factory, if you see on the right-hand side, that represents the global North. Left-hand side is the global South. We had the initial industrial revolution where factories started putting their waste first out the back door and into their backyard, and they would burn them and dump them there. Then the neighbors said that was horrible. You cannot do that anymore. So the companies built smokestacks so they could then burn the material and have the smoke go farther away from the neighbors. But then the people downwind also had problems and they complained. So the factory said, oh, we'll close that down and we'll put a pipe and just dump this waste into the river or into the lakes. And then people, the fishermen and the people using the beaches complained. So the next development was to, how can we hide this waste? We'll take it out to sea and dump it. And that was also tried. And what they were looking for was the path of least resistance, finding ways to have others or the earth pay for the damage that you're causing by your production. Instead of mitigating it or preventing it or paying for it yourself, you're looking for other people to pay that bill. And as the costs were internalized through regulation over time, like in the United States, we had nuisance laws that stopped the burning locally in backyard dumps. We then had the Clean Air Act, which banned the use of these smokestacks to just move things further away. We had the Clean Water Act, which banned the dumping in lakes and rivers. And then with respect to ocean dumping, we had the London Convention on International Treaty that banned that. So we were preventing people, and by doing that, we were internalizing the cost, raising the price. So the last avenue for exploitation and externalization has been to export the waste to the global South. This is externalization. It can also be just considered exploitation of developing countries that lack the regulation or the means to properly regulate or to internalize costs. So that's the development that we have seen. And some truism pathway of the greatest opportunity for cost externalization. These opportunities are functions of disparities in political or economic power. If you think about Japan and Malaysia. And such waste trade is more than export, it is exploitation. who pays for these hidden costs, these externalized costs? It's important to really ground this concept in the realities of plastic recycling, plastic waste trade. So for an example, with plastics, when this stuff moves across the ocean, who's paying the greenhouse gases, the cost of that damage emitted as the ship burns bunker fuel to cross the ocean? Who pays for impaired human health of workers in the recycling plant that must breathe volatile organic compounds? Who pays for the loss of safe drinking water when the groundwater and surface waters are contaminated and are loaded with microplastics from the washing of the dirty plastic waste? Who pays for the cancer-causing exposure from the dumping and burning of unrecyclable plastic waste? Those same pictures that Puyi just showed you. Those are causing pollution, toxic exposure, cancer. Who pays for a farmer's loss of livelihood when it's discovered that his crops, animals' milk and eggs are contaminated with toxins like dioxin? So these are real costs, and they're very expensive, and nobody is paying these costs. The Japanese are not having to pay these costs. The Americans that export to Malaysia are not having to pay these costs. And this is why waste moves. So if you kind of look at the simple picture of this, plastic or electronic waste, that waste that's moving around the world right now, in the global north, you're dealing with this material when it's very clean. You make that material by doing a very dirty part of the life cycle, which is extraction, mining, and chopping down forests to make these products. So the products go to the global north. They're enjoyed with very little externalities there. And then we send the waste back. So the life cycle of this material, the dirtiest parts of it, are being borne disproportionately by those that live in the global south. And this is a sad picture that it's simplified, it's all too true. In a globalized world, poorer countries and communities are disproportionately burdened from toxic use, toxic production, and toxic waste, including plastics. The life cycle of most products we consume tells a story of environmental injustice.
そして、
Our job,
我々の仕事は、これから、
our job is to reverse this by ensuring all costs
これ
make
が
sense.
すべての、
And if
も
they
っと、
do, that we internalize those costs at the outset. So that's why waste moves. And then that's
で、これ
why
が
waste colonialism is
コンベン
caused
ション、
as
ベーゼル
preventative
コンベンションが行われます。
international law. It's a treaty on waste. It's the world's only treaty on waste, which is designed to address this type of waste colonialism. So the Basel Convention, I'm
バ
hearing
ゼ
the
ルコンベンション
translation.
条約には、その国境を越えての
Hopefully
砲
people can
撃
find
を
the
考
channel
慮
and,
します。
and I will try to understand myself here. Basel Convention on the Control of the Transboundary Movement of Hazardous is the world's only treaty on waste, adopted in 1989 in Basel, Switzerland, and thus the name, and entered into force in 1992. Currently, there's 191 members, or parties as they're called, and BAN has been a civil society watchdog of the Basel Convention since 19 there as observers. So real quick primer on Basel, you'll have the quickest explanation of what it's for other waste. And so plastic can either be a hazardous plastic waste or it can be what's called another waste, Annex 2 waste. So these are according to annexes. It can also be defined by national law. But basically you're ash and certain plastic wastes, which we're going to talk a little more about, that are now being considered as a controllable plastic. And soon in 20, there's going to be non-hazardous electronic waste, e-waste, will be added to this list of what's to be controlled. So the way you control this material is the default method is what's called prior informed consent. And that's a procedure where you notify the country that you're going to want to send them waste, and they have to agree to it or it cannot go. And that procedure is defined in the convention. If you don't follow that procedure, it's considered illegal traffic. There are also prohibitions. So parties may ban imports nationally, as China has done, as everyone now realizes. There's also a blanket ban on exports to Antarctica in the convention, and there's a ban on trade between parties to the convention and non-parties. The United States is a non-party, so trade between parties like Malaysia and the United States of controlled Basel waste is illegal. And then there's the Basel Ban Amendment, which is something I've worked on for many years, and it's finally went into force in 2019. And that bars or prohibits the export of hazardous waste from the OECD to the non-OECD countries, from developed to developing countries. And that's now part of the treaty. So in the beginning with Basel, they were mostly dealing with factory wastes. That has changed. And now today, what we're dealing with is post-consumer waste. So things that we've used, things that industry has used, like old ships that are now defunct and are obsolete. And it's not the factory residual waste that we had in the beginning of the treaty, it's post-consumer waste. And this plays out with ships that are being dumped in the global south in India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. It plays out with electronic waste, mostly going to Africa and Asia. And now the attention is turning to plastic waste trade. Most of that currently is going to Southeast Asia, Turkey, and growing amounts are going to Mexico from the United States. So the plastic amendments happened in 2019. I'm going to speed up a little bit here of why those amendments were adopted. But the intent ensure control and transparency through the PIC procedure for exports and imports of plastic wastes, which are most likely to cause harm, particularly to developing countries and the marine environment, even during and after recycling. So that was the impetus. There we all were in 2019 in the big room, adopting these new amendments. Very exciting. There's some of us NGOs that are supporting what was known as the Norwegian Amendment, and it was passed, and overwhelmingly by consensus, to start to control plastics. And this is what it actually looked like. This is what was passed. These are the new listings of plastics. And basically what they did was they said, we're going to divide all the plastic waste into 3 categories. First one is non-hazardous. The second one is hazardous plastic. And then everything else, and that everything else is really important because for the first time they said, we're going to control plastics, even if they're not hazardous, that meet this criteria of the important category known as Y48. That's an extremely important thing to look at, especially when we're looking at any of this trade coming into Malaysia. A lot of that material is Y48. It should be controlled. It should be illegal to bring from Europe, illegal to bring from the US, and from Japan, it should all be notified and consented to before it can arrive. We don't think that's happening. So everything else is defined by being contaminated shipments, mixtures of polymers. So they're mixed types of waste like PP and polystyrene and PVC, etc. They can be halogenated polymers, and PVC is one of those. And they also have to be going to a destination other than R3. They cannot be going to landfills and incinerators without being controlled. So that's another criteria of Y48. If something's going to an incinerator, it's automatically going to be controlled. If it's going to a landfill, automatically controlled. So it also will be controlled if it's going to destinations that are not expected to be environmentally sound management. So all these facilities that should be environmentally sound management, which means they don't have trucks leaving in the night, dumping things in nearby fields and burning them. So the contamination levels allowed to date around the world are set by countries individually. And as you can see, Malaysia has 0 tolerance for non-plastic contaminants in these loads. That's a very high rate of intolerance. And so that means anything that's in that load that's not plastic, that's food waste or wood or what have you, should not be coming into Malaysia. And with respect to non-target plastics, they only allow up to 5%. So we are pretty certain that much of this waste coming from Japan is contaminated with non-plastic. It would be really hard to have a 0% level there. And we'll talk more about that later. So that everything else is really important. That's the Y48 category. The controls invoked for Y48 are the prior informed consent procedure again. You got to have the assurances of environmentally sound management. Failure is going to be illegal, criminal traffic. But there are 2 key instances that a ban is also in effect rather than prior informed consent. And that's if it's coming from the EU or coming from the United States. Those should not be coming in. Mixed plastics, PVC, etc. So we're going to hurry through these examples of Y48 and why we think so much of this material that's coming into Malaysia is probably Y48. Most municipal plastic, they cannot sort it to the extent of not having just one polymer. It's always mixed polymers. So much of our plastic generation from cities is going to be mixed. With respect to that, we have proof that even those places that still have high levels of contamination. This is PET bottles from California. They have 14% contamination. So it is Y48. Same with agricultural waste. It's very high levels of contamination, 30 to 40%, dirt, etc. The e-waste, electronic waste plastics, the same thing. The recyclers can't separate the different types of polymers. These are all the different types of polymers that make up computer plastics. They're mixed, so they're going to be Y48. PVC, as I mentioned, because it's halogenated, it's Y48. So looking now at Japan and the Basel Convention, Puyi has covered much of this already, but it's really startling when you look at first the history of Japan with respect to Basel and where we are at now. So since 1989, Japan has vehemently opposed the Basel Convention's primary environmental justice action. That's the adoption of the Ban Amendment, and this still remains true. This is now part of the treaty, but Japan refuses to accept it, refuses to ratify it, even though it's part of the treaty, and will not accept that there should be no exports of hazardous waste to developing countries. Right now, there's 104 parties that have agreed to it. Japan is not one of those. Further, Japan has in the past sponsored many initiatives in the region, the 3R initiative, the bilateral free trade agreements that Japan tried to sign were all seeking to avoid the Ban Amendment and to promote instead waste trading within the Asia-Pacific region. So those are not good initiatives on the part of Japan. They work against environmental justice. So we were really happy to see in 2019 that Japan supported the new plastic amendments. So they should be praised for that. But they are now working against similar agreements to control non-hazardous e-waste. And so that's not a good thing. Again, looking at the data, what the data tells us is that Japan, when it respect to exports to non-OECD countries, Mexico and Turkey, they're the world champion exporter, taking advantage of the economic disparities between the exporter and the importing country. Of all those countries, it's remarkable that Japan is the world champion. And with respect to receiving waste, plastic waste, Malaysia is the world champion receiver. And so it is very appropriate that we really focus in on what's going on with Japan and Malaysia, because this is a real hotspot in the world of waste colonialism and cost externalization. When you look at a Sankey chart here, you can see again that Malaysia is number 1, Vietnam number 2, and the disparity between non-OECD and OECD is really remarkable. Why isn't Japan sending things to OECD countries? Again, let's remember why waste moves, cost externalization. And as you've noted, the plastic waste going to Malaysia is increasing. It's not decreasing from Japan. This is not a good sign. So most plastic waste trade is likely to be Y48. PVC as a halogenated polymer is Y48, and therefore notification and consent is needed between Basel parties like Japan and Malaysia. So are we getting that? Looking at the different types of plastics that you can identify by the customs codes, there's only a few that are identifiable. So one of those, as you see in the middle, is PVC. 9 million kilograms of that came in 1 year in 2023 to Malaysia from Japan. And because it's PVC and a halogenated polymer, it has to be Y48. It has to be notified and it has to be consented to before it can come in. So this is important to look at because we have over 9 million kilograms of PVC waste exported in 2023 alone from Japan to Malaysia. PVC is Y48, yet the Malaysian authorities reported, and it's in the report that you were announcing today, that they only received 10 total notifications that year asking for consent to import. Now, 900 million kilograms is 9,000 metric tons of PVC. A container of PVC weighs about 17 metric tons. So in total, we divide and realize that this equates to about 530 containers of PVC. The individual shipments average about 2.12 containers. So there should be 250 notifications and consents just for PVC from Japan to Malaysia. Yet for all of 23, all the countries in the world besides Japan, Malaysia's only received 10 prior informed consent notifications. So it's clearly there's something wrong with this picture. In this case, Japan is not properly notifying of what are likely to be 250 different shipments. And how many other types of shipments are they not notifying that are not PVC? How many other categories of that chart that you saw, the polystyrene, et cetera, are contaminated or mixed? So exports controlled waste such as Y48 without such notifications are illegal traffic and a criminal act. So we really have a problem here as identified just by PVC alone. So I'm going to leave it at that and wrap up with some conclusions. Waste commonly moves to take advantage of opportunities to externalize and avoid costs, make somebody else pay the bill for your pollution. And despite the green reputation of recycling, plastics recycling is never 100% and is highly polluting. There appears to be a singular lack of Basel compliance by industry and both governments involved in this case. And government transparency on waste trade is sorely lacking. And yet the public has the right to know. We need to know in any country of the world what waste we're exporting, what we're importing, where it goes, and who it can harm. I thank you very much.
Thank you so much for the very insightful presentation, Jim. Now, we will have Ms. Lauren Weir. He is the Senior Ocean Campaigner for Environmental Investigation Agency. Mine Domestic Waste Management. The floor is all yours, Lauren.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen in PowerPoint. Can everyone see that PowerPoint?
Yes, you can see it clearly.
Fantastic. Thank you. So thank you very much, everyone, for the opportunity to present today. So I'm going to be going through some of the work that we have been undertaking at the Environmental Investigation Agency on the plastic waste trade. In particular,
聞こえますか？大丈夫ですかね？その日本語の通訳聞こえ
capacity displacement, the EU waste shipment regulation revision, and how the plastic waste trade should
の
also
廃棄レギュレーション
Okay, so of the 460 million tons of plastic we now produce globally every year, much of which is single use, 77% has
70%
the focus on recycling gave rise to the global plastic waste trade, despite recycling levels being so low globally overall. So as Jim touched on, the plastic waste trade is underpinned by financial power dynamics. So high-income countries invest in waste collection, but not in adequate treatment infrastructure. So instead, they're exporting their plastic elsewhere for treatment. This is not driven by the desire to attain the most environmentally sound outcome, but because it's economically convenient for high-income countries to place the burden of waste management on others, but to reap the recycling target rewards from that. So as you can see in the figures on the slide, for example, the historic and current top exporters and producers per capita of plastic waste are the EU, the US, the UK, and Japan. And the top importers are in Asia, especially Southeast Asia, as well as Turkey, and more recently, Latin America. So another fundamental driver behind all of this global trade is also the excessive production and consumption of plastic in these exporting
の、
countries.
そ
So to address issues from the plastic waste trade, we also need ambitious and timely plastic reduction. So in addition to the environmental and human health harms stemming from this trade, which is worsened by the high level of criminality as well, it is also crucial to account for the additional impact of recycling capacity displacement. So what is that? That's when high-income country plastic waste exports are taking up the available recycling capacity in recipient countries, which in turn inhibits collection and recycling of domestically generated plastic waste. So we published a report on this in 2023 with a focus on the EU and major recipient countries of EU plastic waste. So our analysis compared import and export data from UN Comtrade and ICIS data on recycling facility capacities for each country to estimate the level of recycling capacity being taken up by exporting country plastic waste. So using best available data, we found that in 2022, Malaysia's plastic waste recycling output volume of approximately 271,000 tons accounted for only 54% of its net imports. Vietnam's domestic recycling output volume of 347,000 tons accounted for 97.4% of its net imports, and net imports made up 78.7% of Turkey's recycling output volume. So what that means, what this shows, is that almost all recycling capacity in these countries were taken up by exports. And in Malaysia's case, there were more exports.
全部オーバーになっております。
Exported plastic waste had a very high residual rate throughout treatment, both of which are incredibly problematic. So as a consequence of all these harms, we have a number of policy recommendations for both the regional EU and the national UK level. So the primary recommendation being that these countries should ban the export of their plastic waste. The import bans and import restrictions in place alone are insufficient in addressing this problem. And export bans are in line with current international obligations. So on the slide, I've made reference to the relevant articles and texts relating to that. So now I will provide a very brief overview, because I know we're running short on time, of the recent revision of the EU waste shipment regulation. So this is the EU regulation that manages shipment of all wastes. We work closely with many others, including of some of today's presenters, including Jim, on this revision. So just as a reminder, the EU Waste Shipment Regulation currently works within the remit of and builds on the Basel Convention and the Basel Convention plastic waste amendments that Jim described. So prior to the revision commencing in 2021, EU plastic waste exports were 1,135 million kilograms, with 51% going to non-OECD countries and Turkey being the largest OECD recipient. When it came to plastic waste exports destined outside of the EU went above Basel obligations by banning the export of Y48 waste, which, as Jim mentioned, is all other plastic waste that are not sorted by polymer, not necessarily destined for recycling, and not almost free from contamination. So they banned the export of this plastic waste to non-OECD countries, in addition to establishing contamination threshold guidance, quantifying plastic waste export contamination limits to 2%, but obviously if the recipient country had stricter contamination thresholds, they would have to adhere to that. There are 4 steps to the revision of a regulation in the EU. So the Commission publishes an initial proposal. The European Parliament and the Council of the EU, 2 separate institutions, then include amendments to that proposal through the adoption of their negotiating mandates. And then these institutions negotiate a compromise on all their respective positions at something called trilogue. So I won't go into detail as to what each institution's position was, as I don't think we've got enough time, but I have included slides with a top-line summary of what they adopted. So that includes the Commission proposal, the European Parliament negotiating mandate, which includes the full ban, the Council negotiating mandate. And so the outcome of those negotiations are as follows. All plastic waste exports to non-OECD countries to be banned 2.5 years after adoption. Following that, non-OECD countries cannot request to receive plastic waste shipments until 5 years after entry into force. And if they do, they have to demonstrate achieving additional obligations than those set out for OECD countries. This includes that there is separate collection for plastic waste. There are prohibitions of open burning of all waste. There are prohibitions on landfilling or incineration of separately collected plastic waste, and that they demonstrate recycling capacity will not be displaced. There are also stricter oversight on plastic waste exports to OECD countries and increased provisions on OECD obligations generally. That includes third-party auditing of recycling facilities prior to export and evidencing of waste management plans. And if these obligations are not met, the possibility for the Commission to suspend all shipments to that country. And as well as the prior informed consent for all extra EU plastic waste exports, so not just Y48 as outlined in Basel. So this revised regulation text from the trilogue was adopted by both the EU Parliament and Council with a significant and unanimous majority respectively earlier this year. So this will soon become law. So in summary, a full ban was not adopted, but regulation is significantly improved, given that depending on the evidence provided, this regulation will act as a de facto ban on EU plastic waste exports outside of the EU. There is the risk that provisions to incentivize the trade of plastic waste within the EU results in regulatory loopholes, like the end of waste criteria for plastic being used to misdeclare waste as recycled plastic. There is also a risk that more EU plastic waste will be shipped to OECD countries, where there is also clear evidence of environmental and human health harm. Therefore, the sufficiency of this regulation very much depends on effective transposition, enforcement, monitoring, and resource allocation. This is coupled with the need for member states, EU member states, to be as transparent as the regulation allows, the effective enforcement of the Environmental Crime Directive to be strict on penalizing illegal shipments, in addition to scrutiny of and adequacy of other related policy and regulatory measures pertaining to plastic within the EU. And that includes things like the Packaging and Packaging Waste Directive. So The outcome of the revised EU waste shipment regulation and the adoption of the Basel Convention plastic waste amendments, along with the national bans and restrictions of other exporting and importing countries of plastic waste, show us three things generally. That the world is acknowledging the issue of the plastic waste trade with the concern it's due and is seeking to put in place adequate safeguarding regulations. However, what is currently and expected to be in place still remains insufficient in addressing the problem, and that all this combined results in a fragmented framework which creates challenges, especially in transparency and enforcement. So fortunately, there is an opportunity for collective action through the Global Plastics Treaty. So our recommendations for this are available to download via this QR code. Briefly, some of them include: currently, the treaty revised zero draft text recognizes the need to address the transboundary movement of plastic waste, with options advocating for prior-informed consent for all shipments, reinforced export requirements, and enhanced transparency in waste transactions. However, it is critical that the text is retained. And we can and should go beyond this to address current regulatory shortfalls. So also, without a provision on plastic waste trade, the treaty fails to enact holistic governance on plastic pollution and adds to this fragmented framework. So most importantly, the new treaty must start upstream with regulations on the production of primary plastic polymers to mitigate the problem at the source. The treaty should also create clear definitions of plastic waste, almost free from contamination and other types of waste, and environmentally sound management. It should also retain more stringent regulation than exists in Basel. This includes strengthening export requirements like prior-informed consent for all shipments and the inclusion of increased import controls. So global permitting systems need for different authorities to communicate. So all this information must be available on a publicly accessible database, which is pre-programmed with additional requirements from national or regional
人に見れるようなことも
trade codes. That facilities importing waste should be certified by independent third parties. Importing authorities should be empowered to reject non-compliant shipments. The creation of clear guidelines for non-compliance are imperative, and the treaty must match other regulatory standards like Basel and also implement a take-back mechanism. The treaty can also create blanket bans on certain polymers of concern or plastics that contain hazardous chemicals. So this should include identifying and prohibiting the export of hazardous or difficult to recycle plastic waste. Exemptions should be narrow and reviewed to account for the unique circumstances of developing states. So non-party trade provisions are crucial, including compliance with ILBI provisions and a ban on imports and exports of plastic waste from non-parties, with limited exceptions. Enforcement is non-negotiable. Establishing mechanisms for immediate action in cases of illegal waste trade or non-compliance is essential, and this includes the suspension of operations for non-compliant facilities and enforcement actions for exporting companies. Real-time reporting of non-compliance and access to justice for affected parties are also paramount. Finally, the treaty should also allocate resources for capacity building, technical assistance, and technology transfer to assist in compliance, but reject funding or technologies that perpetuate harmful waste treatment practices. So thank you very much for your time. I would like to add that our Plastic Waste Trade Global Plastics Treaty work is led by my excellent colleague Amy Youngmin, and very fortunately she's attending today, so is happy to help any questions that you might have on the treaty. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the informative presentation, Lauren, and for sharing the critical recommendations from AIA. Last but not least, we have Dr. Shiori Shakuto, a lecturer in Anthropology from University of Sydney, Australia. She will present on the understanding Japan's attachment to plastic and Japanese perception on waste. Please go ahead, Dr. Shiori.
Thank you, Nabila. I'm just going to share my screen. Hopefully you can see the slides.
Yes, we can see it.
Excellent. Thank you everyone for your excellent presentation. And as Lauren mentioned, we need to also focus on reducing waste in origin, the country that's exporting plastic waste. So I will be today speaking about some of the factors that contributes to perhaps the overuse of plastics in Japan, and why is it so difficult to reduce plastics in Japan. So in summary, I will be speaking about three things. The first point I will be making is that the use of plastics in Japan is entangled with various forms of social inequalities in Japan, and that leads to the difficulty of reducing plastic waste. And the second point I'll be making is how some of the environmental acts, something that looks like an environmentally conscious act, might not necessarily be motivated by environmental discourse. So I'll be speaking about the apparent lack of environmental.
まあ、やっぱりこの環境の意識もね、その日本
And is also known as a country that does a very stringent recycling or sorting of rubbish. And finally, I will conclude by suggesting two ways in which perhaps we can move forward. So the first point, the use of plastics is entangled with various social inequalities in Japan. And I'll be focusing on three inequalities. One is gender, second is class, the third is rural-urban divides. So let's start with gender. The point about gender inequality and plastic became very apparent when I was conducting interviews with women in Tokyo, in urban city centers of Tokyo and Osaka. So when I was asking my participants, what were some of the plastic products that you would miss most, or what plastic products you feel you can't live without if Japanese government were to ban plastics? The number one and two things that these women answered was cling wrap and Ziplocs. So here is a magazine article that I got from archival work. This is a magazine article from 1990s. It was from a women's magazine, encouraging women to cook a lot of food in advance over the weekend and to make it into small packets of food and to store it in a freezer. Now, this magazine or this type of magazines are still apparent in 2023. Last year, when I went back to Japan, I could buy different women's magazine or cooking magazines that encourages the exact same message. Now, this message has to be understood within a very specific socio-historical context where Japanese women were expected to, and many Japanese women did desire to provide food for the family. But in contemporary Japan, there's also a social pressure, economic pressure for women to work long hours as well. So shouldering the both burden of work and care, many women try to negotiate that through the use of plastics. So many of them would cook a lot of food over the weekend and to use the cling wrap and plastic bags to store them in the freezer. And many audience would also know that Japanese food, often each meal comprises of 5 or 6 different meals. Probably the most popular example is bento box. That comes with many different types of food. So there is the pressure. So in addition to cooking in advance, a lot of women also use takeaway food or the supermarket ready-made food, at least 1 or 2 side dishes to bring it home. So here's the reason why plastics is so entangled with the unequal expectations placed upon the woman's shoulder. Second one I've observed is the urban-rural divides. So between 1960s to the 80s, when Japan was going through the rapid economic growth, there was a mass migration of population from the rural areas to urban centers of Tokyo and Osaka. So in those rural areas and suburban areas, small grocery shops that used to sell vegetables and meats without plastics couldn't survive. These shops were quickly replaced by convenience stores and large-scale supermarkets. And in turn, the use of plastics, so the plastic film was essential, vital element of the spreading of these large supermarkets. So in a way, the economic growth, as Jim and Lauren was making a point, the economic growth of a particular country relied upon the use of plastics. to enable that. And finally, the class. So as Japan was going through economic growth, a lot of population moved to urban centers, and there were rapid development of small-scale housing called danchi complex, so apartments that houses a lot of number of people in a small spaces. So plastics again became very important element of a domestic culture to store things, to organize things. So this is again another magazine article from 1990s encouraging women to go to the 100 yen shop or the $1 shop to buy small plastic containers to organize their spaces. Even today, when I was conducting interviews with my participants in urban centers, many of them said their spaces, their kitchens are so small, they only have one stovetop. But it's impossible to cook 5 or 6 different dishes on one stove every night. So a lot of them do rely on microwaves for cooking. And again, if you go to Japan and look at the cooking magazines, the instructions for cooking many foods is actually using microwave. So a lot of food in Japan is cooked inside the microwave. And in order to cook food in a microwave, people do rely on microwavable plastic containers or plastic wrap. Related to that, the lack of space meant that it's very difficult to sort rubbish. So in urban centers, the rates of recycling or the sorting of rubbish is much lower than the rural areas. Also, there are a lot of single households in urban areas. Many of them are working poor. A lot of my participants said they do wait until 10 p.m. to go to the convenience store where they drastically reduce the price of food before they throw it out, essentially. And these foods are wrapped in plastic film. So in conclusion, from this first point, Japan's high growth era created various inequalities, which in turn propelled the use of plastics. And these inequalities are continuing today. I'll now move on to second point, which is that environmental practices in Japan might happen without environmental discourses. So here what I have in mind is these questions that I'm often asked. How is it that the Japanese people produce so much plastic waste when the Japanese citizens are also known to recycle or to sort their rubbish into so many different categories? What's this paradox? So here I visited the village of Kamikatsu in Tokushima Prefecture. This town has become so famous because it was the first town in Japan to declare itself to be the zero waste village. What they do is that the residents of this village is comprised of 2,000 residents, mostly older people. They are required to sort their rubbish into 45 different categories. Now, that's a lot more than what most households in Japan do. Most households in Japan, on average, sort their rubbish into 15 different categories. Kamikatsu does 45 categories, and just plastics alone, each individual household sort their plastic rubbish into 5. But when I went there, the person in the city council told me an interesting observation, which is that the population in the village has been declining over the years, but the rubbish has been increasing steadily. So why is it that in this zero waste town, people are sorting their rubbish into 45 different categories, yet the rubbish continues to increase? So I started to ask some questions to people. So one resident at a Kamikatsu village told me, how to sort rubbish is always in my mind. But I never think about reducing waste when I shop. So here it shows the breakdown of a circular economy. I saw one person in the Q&A asked, is circular economy an answer? Circular economy assumes that the consumptions and recycling is connected in our environmental consciousness, but not necessarily so. Similarly, when I asked the resident in Osaka, she said, I always bring my eco bag to the supermarket, which appears to be an environmentally conscious behavior. But then she says, in the supermarket, I then get free plastic liners. I use plastic liner because I don't want my bag to get dirty. So here again, you can see the disconnect between an environmental action and environmental discourse. Here was an interesting example. A resident in Tokyo said, I regularly exchange my baby clothes with my neighbors, but I never say that it's for the environment. I phrase the exchange of baby clothes as a measure to save money. And this person actually is very environmentally conscious, and she claims herself to be that. But she says she does not want others to know that she's environmentally conscious. And in fact, of all the interviews that I've conducted, not a single person said they ever talk about environmental issues with their friends. They do seem to avoid that. So again, here, there might be an environmental discourse or consciousness, but in terms of discourse or in terms of verbal communication, that's not really happening in the Japanese society. Finally, a worker who works at the sorting center in Kamikatsu told me that the recycling center has more than just one function, more than just an environmental cause. It also operates as a checkpoint for the village's well-being. So he says, we visit the homes of the seniors and help them bring the rubbish to the sorting center. This way we would know if the seniors are living alone and not feeling well. So here you can see maybe the driver for some of the environmental actions might not just be an environmental reason. It could be more. So from these two observations, I will finish by making two possible ways we can move forward. From the first observations of inequality, I would say the various domestic inequalities and transnational racial injustice, which has been the point has been made by Jim and Lauren, these together have created the contemporary state of plastic environmental disaster. So environmental justice is not achieved by just addressing environmental problems, but we need to address larger intersecting social justice issues at the same time. And the second suggestions that I have is that we might need to go beyond environmental discourse and move towards a more relational approach. And what do I mean by that? These two quotes by some of my participants might exemplify this. So the first person sort their rubbish very diligently. So when I asked her what motivates her to do that, she said, I was moved by the story shared on Twitter. Because someone put the wrong rubbish into plastic rubbish bin, the cleaning person had to resort the entire container of rubbish. It made me reevaluate my sorting practice. And the second person in Kamikatsu village I said, well, sorting rubbish into 45 categories must be very tiring. Then she replied, I know people who work at the sorting center. I make sure I sort it properly, otherwise they will scold me and I'll get embarrassed. So these two quotes suggest that some of the most effective way forward might be to reveal the faces of those that's involved in the plastic chain. So as you can see from the first quote, it might be happening at the domestic scale, little bit by showing the faces of those who work at the recycling center. But I think we need to do that at the more transnational scale. So reports written by C4, said this particular report is excellent in revealing some of the faces of people affected in Malaysia. And by advocating for or by sharing these messages and faces of people, we might be able to move more towards a better plastic future or better environmental future. So I will stop here. Thank you very much. And if you have any questions or comments, please do feel free to send me an email. And I would like to also acknowledge that some of the research was funded by Singapore Ministry of Education. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shiori, for the insightful presentation. We appreciate that we can hear the Japanese point of view on plastic use to fully understand their awareness and the fascinating story on the Japan's environmental practices. I hope we can all work together to address the social injustice in the future. So next session will be the Q&A with our presenters. If you guys have any questions, please send them in the Q&A chat box, or you can raise your hand if you would like to be unmuted and ask verbally. Our event and project officer, Wong Sipeng, who is also involved with this project, will moderate the Q&A session. Sipeng, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Nabila. So I was actually hoping to have some time to ask some questions, but we actually have like 7 questions in our Q&A area. But just very quickly, if both Lauren and Jim can actually help give some insights to this, because I think Lauren mentioned that even with the waste shipment regulation that's currently passed in EU, there's going to be exceptions for non-party trade. So this is a similar situation, I think, that I could relate to the Basel Convention having Article 11, where it allows, still trade to take place. So what are the additional learnings, from either Basel Convention's Article 11's gaps and still putting exceptions, for trade to still take place? Any one of you want to take this?
Yeah. Somebody asked me once, what's the worst thing that was done when they created the Basel Convention? And my answer has been, after all these years, that they should never have created this exception that you're talking about, that parties can trade with non-parties. It was done for a good reason. When the treaty was being first negotiated and first started getting adherence to it in parties, there was very few parties. So they wanted to make sure they weren't being discriminating against those countries that hadn't ratified yet. But what's happened is, with this exception, is it's being abused. And we've done a webinar at the last Basel meeting about the different examples of how the exception is being abused. The EU is using it, the OECD group is using it, Canada and the US is using it to avoid the Basel Convention. Rather than becoming a real player, they're making rules that are less stringent than the Basel Convention. For example, Canada and the US just decided by themselves to allow a free trade in plastic waste, even though these new amendments were in place. They just decided to ignore them, which is completely unacceptable. But there's no police that's going to come in and say, you guys are doing it wrong. So the lesson learned here is, really, let's not make exceptions. If there's going to be exceptions, they should be time limited, and there should be some scrutiny of them by the Secretariat of the Convention. Maybe Lauren has something to add.
Thanks, Jim. I really don't. Jim's the expert in this, so I really don't have much to add. I'd just like to caveat, though, that there are also issues with being a party and with being in line with current Basel Convention obligations. That is evidenced with the harms brought about by EU plastic waste exports to Turkey, for instance. And so I think there's a huge amount to consider with regards to what is already obliged and adopted by different countries, and really focus on enforcement of that, effective enforcement and monitoring to ensure compliance as well.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think you brought up a very important point about the need for the monitoring, right? So for the EU WSR amendments, is it the monitoring of making sure that the contamination level is below the 2% and so on? Is that all monitored through the EU Parliament? Is there a body set up, a secretariat?
So that's a very good question. So there are two answers to this. The first being that the EU cannot effectively monitor its plastic waste exports, and that's been evidenced. In the slides, I've made a hyperlink to the European Court of Auditors report, who came to the same conclusion. And so, in part, the revision of the waste shipment regulation tried to really clarify
やっぱりその家とか
states needed to monitor, needed to look out for, what obligations needed to be met to try and, foster and cultivate that. Within the EU, monitoring happens at the national EU level. So this is an EU regulation, and now it is for EU member states like Germany, like France, like Poland, to transpose that international law. And so there are requirements for member states to undertake inspections. We wanted that to be quantified. We wanted that to be stricter in the regulation. That didn't come to be. But you know, very fortunately, like international obligation text and text in the EU really does stipulate that these countries have a responsibility and an accountability to make sure that they are monitoring. So with the adoption of this regulation, I'm sure many of us here are really going to be honing in and looking and making sure that that's happening and call it out when it's not.
Thank you very much, Lauren. So now my next question, probably also one of the questions that's being asked by one of our participants, Dana Winograd. So it's relating to the presentation that Dr. Shiori did just now about the culture in Japan where microwave is used a lot. Yeah, where food in packaging is put into microwaves for reheating purposes, so that you know the women could serve food to their family promptly. Are they aware of health dangers? Perhaps Jim also could add on to that about the toxicity in plastics.
Yeah, thank you.
Go ahead.
Oh, that's all right. Quickly, no, thanks for the really good point. That could be the advocacy point. There was health scare relating to plastics, putting plastics into the microwave in about late 1990s to early 2000s. But the awareness seems to be that since plastic products have improved, therefore you can put it in the microwave. I don't know if that's true or not. But when I did ask questions about the health effects of microplastics, many people replied that they haven't really thought about it. So I think the health is a good avenue for activism, definitely.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. From the short times I've been in Japan, it's clearly a food culture, and it's also a very aesthetic culture. And those things just clash with plastic, because plastic, people don't realize, is full of toxic chemicals. Every characteristic of plastic is defined by what types of additives you put into the polymer to make it have certain qualities, whether it be color or flame retardancy or what have you. But people just think it's plastic. They don't realize that these things have endocrine disrupting chemicals that are causing harm to their children, and they're all born through the food because of the packaging of food. So that is something, once there's full transparency, which is what we're demanding at the new treaty, of all these additives, I think cultures that care about food, that care about their children, which is just about everyone, will be very concerned because it isn't just a microwave issue. It's more than that. It's microplastics. It's many toxic chemicals that are in our plastics, and we need that transparency and that understanding. So we're hoping that this new treaty will require a full inventory and disclosure of every toxic additive, every type of additive. They haven't figured out the harm from it, and it will be much more transparent. We'll be able to phase them out based on their harm, getting rid of the worst first.
Thank you very much. We're going to try and answer the questions that are in the Q&A. So that we have one that's from Ms. Pua Lei Ping, who is actually one of the communities that is affected by the illegal dumping. And just going to paraphrase her question a little bit. She's mentioning about in her community, PVC waste is often shredded and dumped. And that is actually the same that we have found during our field research work as well. There's that new shape of waste that is currently being found illegally dumped. They're shredded beyond recognition. So it's hard to point which country it came from. So this is going to add challenge for us to identify, and pinpoint which is the exporting country to blame, or I don't know, just to solve the issue and be able to repatriate any containers if the container reveals all shredded PVC or waste, right?
Yeah. Well, part of this problem, of course, is that this recycling of plastic. Somebody asked about the circular economy. What we're realizing is that plastic is not inherently circular. Unlike other materials like glass or paper, where you can do proper recycling if you really take care, plastics is just fraught with so many problems that keep it from being recyclable. And this is why we've only recycled 10% throughout history. And you're not going to change that. That's why we have to go upstream and stop making so much plastic. And PVC is a classic example. Really difficult to recycle, and you really don't want to recycle it because you're going to create all kinds of pollution doing so. Whenever you burn it or heat it, you're going to off-gas vinyl chloride or make dioxins, etc. So it's really, the problem is in the plastic itself, as has been said by Puyi earlier. So we got to get out of this mindset that we're going to recycle our way out of this problem. It's not going to be possible. There's a reason only 10% has ever been recycled. And by the way, that figure includes everything that was sent to developing countries that is only very partially recycled. So that figure is also erroneous.
Being very conscious of time, so Puyi has her hand up. So as our report co-author, maybe I'll let you take one or two more questions. And we thank you all who have posted questions. We will try and reply it later.
Oh dear. Okay, so, okay, sorry, I don't want to answer any question. I just wanted to pose questions to Jim, because as a follow-up, Ms. Phua also asked, is there any provisions in the Basel Convention for us to hold exporting countries accountable? Does our country need to go through Basel Convention, or can we as citizens do it? And another one related to Basel is for prior informed consent. So things are coming in most likely without prior informed consent. What can we do? Yeah, so there's two Basel Convention questions.
Yeah, so enforcement of international treaties has got to be done by the countries themselves. And if Japan is sending things, according to the trade data they are, like PVC, that requires prior informed consent, where we've done the math to show that it's impossible that they have done that if what Malaysia is saying is true, that they've only gotten 10 notifications, something is really wrong. And so Malaysia has to enforce. They have to do inspections at the ports. They have to see the stuff coming in. When it comes in not declared or misdeclared, they have to report back to Japan about that and take it up with Japan directly. There is a non-compliance mechanism at Basel, but it requires, again, that one of the countries concerned, either the exporting country or the importing country, takes the complaint to that compliance committee. So countries have to take action. If countries are just allowing this to happen, which seems to be the case at the moment, and there's no transparency to the public, we really have a problem. And it's obvious with the pictures that Puyi has shown that we do have a problem. You cannot recycle this plastic 100%. Sometimes only 50% is recyclable. And even if the plants look very nice when you have a tour of the inside, at night the trucks leave, they dump, and they burn the material that they cannot recycle. So this is the reality, and greater enforcement is imperative.
So we're gonna have to move on to our closing statement already. I would like to ask all the panelists to just remain online so that we could take a photo with Hiro, who's gonna do the closing, group photo with Hiro, who's gonna do the closing statement. And thank you all the participants for all your questions. We are out of time, so we'll let Hiro do his closing statement, and I'll hand it over to Hiro then.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Thank you so much for the first of all panelists for giving us amazing, insightful presentations. I've learned a lot, and I'm sure many of us have learned as well. It is, in a way, unfortunate. I mean, it is unfortunate as a Japanese and also someone working in Japan on the plastic issues to see so much of problems that are arising from build the society and how they conduct the business around the plastics. Let me just give some comment related to some of the gender aspect that I find it very fascinating. The book I was reading recently was talking about how even the woman participation in the mainstream traditional economic sector increases, their burden on the care work does not decrease. Therefore, the women still continue to play the biggest role in both care economy and let's say mainstream traditional economy. In reality, some of the feminist economists estimate that the gender sustain more than half of the global economy, which is not counted. So in that sense, I think there is very much the plastic play the role in a way that enabling that participation, but also as a tool to extract more from the workers, which I think we've seen as always. And I find it very fascinating that how the plastic is related to the gender issues, especially in Japan. And I see that every, daily basis from my mom and from my, friends and stuff. So I think that's the persistent and it needs a fundamental change. On the plastic waste trade and also the non-party provisions, I think there are very important discussions which we are raising also domestically. And I pretty much appreciate the support from especially Malaysia or other Southeast Asia countries to raise a voice, especially toward the target in Japan as well. The weakness of Japan is that the current policy says that they would gain the favor and approval or support from the global South, especially Southeast Asia, which we know why. Obviously, they are thinking about China, but hey, this is a moment I think we can collectively, this network, utilize this opportunity to pressure Japan to act better, support the interests of the global South. As you have already indicated that the presentation have shown that Japan is sustaining and supporting sort of colonizations, waste colonizations, and waste dumping, which is against, a lot of human rights issues and against environmental protections. So in the treaty, we have trying to move Japan around this global South engagement. One thing is a just transition, one thing the waste trade. We would, again, happy to discuss with you further, anyone who has an idea how to pressure more the Japanese government to move on these issues. You have embassies, you have JICA, you have a lot of targets that are available in your countries to make move and make noise. We are happy to coordinate, we're happy to work with you on this. Again, we really need, it's very hard to push this message within Japan only because they don't see the benefit, let's say beneficially, or the people who are actually suffering, and it's not easy to get MPs to realize how bad the things are. The data doesn't get it. Data doesn't cut, the image, voice, storytelling, narratives that matter. So in this context, I think that's why I think it is absolutely important to have this kind of dialogue, to continue the conversations, so that we will be able to collaborate further on this matter. I'll be in INC4, so anyone going to be there, looking forward to seeing you. The conversation was fascinating. So once again, thank you so much for the organizers to put together this amazing list of speakers, and they managed to put this Zoom meeting. I hope that we will be able to continue these conversations and they get the right content within the treaty. So keep fighting. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Shirotaka, for your concluding statement. Now, as we ending our event, I would like for every panelist to open their camera up for a photo session.
All right, I will count you in. So here's the first photo. 3, 2, 1.
Great.
All right, let's
everyone.
just do one more. Okay. 3, 2, 1. All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, everyone. On behalf of C4 Center, we would like to thank our panelists, Jim, Lauren, Dr. Shiori, and also Hirotaka for your time, especially with the different time zone and your consideration to share your expertise with us. We would also like to convey our thanks to everyone who has been working on this issue, and we hope we can combat this waste colonialism together. Thank you again for all the participants for your time to join this event. Just a few announcements before we end the webinar. We would appreciate to hear your feedbacks on today's event. Please scan the QR code here to share your feedback. Our full report will be available in our website soon, but please note that this report is a temporary first advance copy only. But feel free to go through the data and information in this first version of the report, as we will upload another version with better designing. And fret not, after this, we will send everyone a follow-up as a thank you email with the aforementioned details and shareable material soon. And for the media who joined us, kindly drop me an email, nabila@c4center.org, in the slide below for our press release. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good day ahead.
Thank you.
How come we're not taking photos with all participants?
Because
cannot
this is a
open-
webinar.
Yes.
Oh,
Yeah. I hope we
Thank
can, though. Thank you so much,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
everyone for
Thank you,
spending
everyone.
an hour plus
Congrats.
with us.